For decades, the public accepted a simple explanation for Roy Orbison's death, that his heart failed without warning. But documents that surfaced years later suggest a far more complicated reality. Medical records indicate his doctors had raised concerns months earlier, noting irregular findings that were never fully explained. Substances appeared in his system that should not have been there. And in the final weeks of his life, Roy's focus shifted. His last known recording session was not about crafting songs for release. According to those accounts, he was preserving information, laying out evidence connected to a tragedy that had already torn his family apart. The house fire that claimed the lives of his two sons was officially ruled accidental. Roy did not believe that conclusion. He believed he had proof to the contrary, and he believed that what he uncovered put him in danger. What he learned about that night, and what he left behind, would later raise disturbing questions about who was truly responsible for the devastation of the Orbison family. Roy Kelton Orbison was born on April 23, 1936, in Vernon, Texas, at 3:30 in the afternoon, during a period when the Dust Bowl still scarred the land and survival demanded resilience from every family. His parents, Orby Lee Orbison and Nain Schultz Orbison, lived modestly, moving where work was available and stretching every dollar. Orby earned a living drilling oil wells and repairing cars, filling Roy's earliest memories with the sounds of engines, machinery, and country music drifting through small-town Texas. Vernon was a hard place, wind-blown, dry, and unforgiving, marked by dust storms and nights that felt endlessly quiet. Yet inside their small home, something began to take shape. At 6 years old, Roy asked his father for a harmonica. Instead, Orby placed a guitar in his son's hands. After long days of labor, he taught Roy basic chords in the evenings. Once the world slowed down, that guitar became a constant presence, quietly setting the direction of Roy's life long before he understood where it might lead. Music quickly became more than a pastime. By 6, Roy was already learning the songs his father played at family gatherings. By 8, he was singing into a microphone at KVWC, Vernon's local radio station, performing Hank Williams numbers like Lovesick Blues. The pay was small, just enough to help with school supplies, but each appearance mattered to a family still feeling the aftershocks of the Great Depression. Listeners noticed something unusual in his voice, a depth and weight that seemed far beyond his years. Word spread about the boy on the radio who sang like someone much older. Around that same time, Roy began writing his own songs, quietly testing his emotions on paper before sharing them aloud. Opportunities continued to grow. At 8, he secured a regular weekly slot on KVWC. At 9, he won a radio contest that earned him his own Saturday program. Sitting outside his grandmother's house, wrote his first original song, A Vow of Love. In 1946, he entered a talent competition linked to a traveling medicine show, performing Mountain Dew and Joel Blunt. He tied for first place and won $15. Roy kept half and gave the rest to a friend who had carried his guitar, a small gesture that revealed his character long before fame arrived. That same year, the Orbison family relocated to Wink, Texas, drawn by work in the oil fields. Wink was stark and isolated, nothing like Vernon. Roy later described it as a place defined by football, oil rigs, grease and sand, hard surfaces with little warmth. The emptiness of the landscape seeped into him, shaping a sense of solitude that would later resonate through his music. At 13, Roy formed his first band, the Wink Westerners. They played country and swing, performing at local dances and honky-tonks. Soon, they secured a weekly radio spot on Kermit Station Curve. Slowly, money began to come in. At one dance, Roy earned $400, a staggering sum for a teenager in the 1940s. Each performance strengthened his belief that music could offer an escape from the limits of his surroundings. Then came a loss that marked him for life. In 1953, when Roy was 17, his mother Nain died suddenly from a respiratory illness. The impact was devastating. Wink already felt remote and unforgiving. Without his mother, Roy felt unmoored. He took on odd jobs to support his father, often working long hours, pumping gas late into the night. Grief drove him inward. Music became the place where he stored everything he could not say. Loneliness, pain, longing. Those emotions would later define the ballads that stopped audiences in their tracks. In 1954, Roy enrolled at North Texas State College in Denton, choosing geology as a practical backup plan. It didn't last. The subject failed to hold his attention. Music did. Within a year, he switched his studies to history and English, continuing to perform with the Wink Westerners alongside Billy Pat Ellis, Dick Penner, and W.D.E. Moore. They played fraternity parties and wrote new material together. In 1955, the group recorded Ooby Dooby at Jim Beck's studio in Dallas, drawing inspiration from the emerging rockabilly sound coming out of Sun Records. When the song gained traction locally, Roy understood something had changed. Music was no longer just a hope, it was a viable future. He left North Texas State after one semester and transferred to Odessa Junior College, where he formed a new group, the Teen Kings. A talent show win soon landed them a television appearance on KMID in Midland, accelerating their momentum and pushing Roy toward a larger stage. That push led to Memphis. In April 1956, the Teen Kings auditioned for Sun Records after a record store owner, Papa Holyfield, played Ooby Dooby to Sam Phillips over the phone. Phillips liked what he heard and invited the band in. On March 19, 1956, they re-recorded the song. A few months later, it entered the Billboard Hot 100, peaking at number 59 and selling roughly 200,000 copies. For the first time, Roy Orbison experienced national recognition. But beneath the success, tension was building. Roy wanted to record emotionally driven ballads. Phillips favored fast-paced rockabilly. Their creative visions diverged. Subsequent singles failed to chart. By the end of 1956, the Teen Kings had dissolved, and Roy's time at Sun Records lasted only 7 months. Frustration followed. Roy became increasingly vocal about royalty disputes, accusing Phillips of taking an unfair share of his earnings, complaints echoed by several Sun artists of that era. What had once felt like a breakthrough now carried the weight of disillusionment, setting the stage for the next chapter of his journey. By December of 1956, the Teen Kings had reached their end, and Roy Orbison finally walked away from Sun Records. For a brief stretch, the future looked uncertain enough that he considered following his father into the oil fields. But music refused to release its grip. That pull returned in an unexpected way when Claudette, a song Roy had written for his wife, became the B-side to the Everly Brothers hit All I Have to Do Is Dream. Released nationally, the record climbed to number 30 in 1959. The royalties arrived quickly and disappeared just as fast. Roy bought a pink Cadillac, spent freely, and soon found himself broke again, back in Wink, Texas, living with his parents. Yet Claudette marked a turning point. It proved he could write songs that traveled far beyond Texas and survive within the industry. In 1957, he signed a publishing deal with Acuff Rose in Nashville. Wesley Rose saw something others had missed and encouraged Roy to focus on songwriting and long-term publishing. That backing gave Roy the leverage to buy out his Sun contract. Not long after, he found himself opening for Johnny Cash at the Grand Ole Opry, an experience that lifted him out of regional obscurity and placed him firmly inside the center of country music. In 1958, Roy returned to the road, touring honky-tonks across the South with the Wink Westerners and Johnny Cash. Night after night, crowds responded loudly to high-energy performances. But something changed when Roy stepped forward for an encore. As his 3-octave voice filled the room, conversations stopped. The noise faded. People listened. That voice, controlled, aching, and immense, pulled him towards something larger than the circuit he was traveling. Then came another setback. Roy discovered that his manager had been stealing money from the tour. The betrayal nearly broke him. He returned to Nashville with barely enough to get by and took work singing demo recordings simply to survive. The experience shook him deeply, but it also forced a reassessment. Out of that reckoning came a pivotal move to Monument Records, where Roy would finally be allowed to pursue the sound he heard in his own head. The sound that would later give the world Only the Lonely and the songs that followed. Roy Orbison walked into Monument Records in 1959, carrying more hope than certainty. Everything shifted when producer Fred Foster heard Uptown. The song carried a heavy, brooding tension, with strings rising behind Roy's falsetto in a slow, deliberate burn. When it was released in late 1960, it reached only number 72 on the Billboard chart. But its B-side told a different story. Only the Lonely arrived in May of 1960 and moved with stunning speed. It climbed to number 2 in the United States, then crossed the Atlantic and reached number 1 in the United Kingdom by October. It remained on the UK charts for 24 weeks, longer than any record Roy would ever release, and sold more than 1 million copies in the US alone. Almost overnight, the quiet man with the enormous voice was everywhere. The sound he and Foster built in the studio, dramatic strings, rising tension, emotional restraint, reset expectations for pop music. Audiences felt the voice before they learned the name. As the momentum grew, Only the Lonely became more than a hit. By the end of 1961, It had sold another million copies in the United States and carried Roy's music into countries barely familiar with American rock. The crescendos, the controlled release, the heartbreak embedded in every note. It sounded unlike anything else on the radio. Other artists took notice. The Beatles listened closely. The Beach Boys studied the structure. Fans held on to that falsetto because it felt like heartbreak lifting itself into the air. The song's long stay on the UK charts marked the beginning of Roy Orbison as a force across both rock and pop, a performer who could command a room without raising his voice. That same quiet authority began to define his image, almost by accident. In 1963, Roy arrived at a show without his prescription glasses. He put on the dark sunglasses he usually wore outdoors. Behind the lenses, he felt less exposed, more protected. The audience saw something else entirely, mystery. He kept them on. Before long, the sunglasses became inseparable from him. From the farthest seat in a stadium, people could recognize Roy Orbison by the reflection of those lenses, just as surely as by the voice that floated above the crowd. His stillness on stage came from the same place. While performers like Elvis Presley moved constantly, Roy stood nearly motionless beneath the lights. When Blue Angel climbed to number 9 in 1961, audiences watched him dressed in black, barely shifting as he let his voice carry the entire performance. It wasn't affectation. It wasn't strategy. It was trust in the power of sound alone. His concerts became moments where time seemed to slow, where rooms leaned inward. Long after the lights went down, people remembered how it felt to stand there and listen. Behind the spotlight, however, strain was building. His marriage to Claudette Frady began to fracture under the weight of constant touring. While Roy was recording Running Scared in 1961, his first #1 hit, he was rarely home. The distance widened. By 1963, as he toured Britain, Claudette, isolated and exhausted, began an affair with a man building their home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. When Roy learned the truth, the impact was devastating. They divorced in November of 1964. Less than a year later, in August 1965, after the birth of their third child, they remarried, attempting to rebuild what fame had quietly eroded. Their relationship became a reflection of Roy's larger story, how success could lift him to extraordinary heights while slowly pulling his personal life apart. Through it all, the music continued to rise. Crying, released in July 1961, became a phenomenon in its own right. It reached #1 on the U.S. Cashbox chart on October 7, 1961, climbed to #2 on Billboard, hit number 25 in the UK, and held a top position in Australia for 3 consecutive weeks that November. More than 8 million copies sold worldwide. The Spanish-style guitar solo lingered in listeners' minds for years, influencing what would later evolve into flamenco rock. The song was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2002, and in 2010, Rolling Stone ranked it number 69 on its list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. It wasn't just a hit, it expanded what popular music could be. Then came the tour that elevated Roy's legend even further. In May 1963, he headlined a UK tour with a young band called the Beatles opening the shows. Few understood what that group was about to become. The tour opened on May 18th and concluded on June 9th in Blackburn, spanning 17 dates across England, Wales, and Scotland. At first, Roy was the clear headliner. But the Beatles' popularity grew so rapidly that promoters soon billed them as co-headliners. Even then, Roy often owned the night. At London's Gaumont Cinema, he performed in Dreams, and the crowd erupted so fiercely that people backstage wondered how anyone could follow him. John Lennon would later call Roy Orbison the greatest singer in the world. Ringo Starr would later admit there was nothing easy about following Roy Orbison on stage. Night after night, Roy would dismantle the room, leaving audiences emotionally spent before the next act ever stepped forward. By 1964, that power only intensified. It's overlifted him even higher, reaching number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and claiming the top position in the United Kingdom, where it held number 1 for 2 weeks and remained on the charts for 18. Roy recorded the song in a single take, immediately after an argument with Claudette. The emotion was unfiltered. Strings surged upward, his voice stretched into anguish, and producer Fred Foster, alongside engineer Bill Porter, captured every fracture of feeling. Cashbox described it as a throbbing lover's lament. Billboard praised the intensity carried in every line. Over time, it became one of the defining recordings of his career. Then came a song that would eclipse even that success. On July 24, 1964, Roy and Bill Dees wrote "Oh, Pretty Woman" in roughly 40 minutes at Roy's home. Claudette announced she was heading out, and Dee's joked that a pretty woman never needs money. Roy immediately sang the opening line, and the song took shape almost instantly. They recorded it on August 1st at RCA Studio B in Nashville, with 4 guitarists layered into the session, Roy among them. By September, it reached #1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. More than 7 million copies sold worldwide, making it his second #1 single. Some radio stations initially refused to play it, claiming the bass line sounded too suggestive. The resistance didn't matter. The song became one of the defining records of the decade. But success carried a cost. While touring in 1964, Roy admitted to encounters with groupies. Claudette, already isolated by distance and long absences, grew increasingly jealous. That tension eventually pushed her toward an affair of her own. When Roy learned the truth, he filed for divorce in November 1964, just as "Oh Pretty Woman" sat at the peak of the charts. By early 1965, the divorce was finalized. Yet within 10 months, they found their way back to one another, attempting to rebuild what fame, fear, and separation had fractured. The peace did not last. On June 6, 1966, Roy and Claudette were riding motorcycles near Gallatin, Tennessee, when a pickup truck pulled into their path. Claudette was thrown from the bike and died in Roy's arms less than an hour later. She was 24 years old. Roy survived with minor injuries, but the shock silenced him. He canceled performances for months and buried her in Hendersonville, then returned to a world that suddenly felt hollow. 2 months later, Too Soon to Know climbed to #3 in the UK, carrying his grief into the public ear. Even before her death, Roy had recorded Crawling Back in October 1965. It reached #46, but his label pushed him toward brighter material that clashed with his emotional reality. The sessions often overwhelmed him. The pressure to sound optimistic collided with the sorrow he carried quietly. In hindsight, the song reads as a subdued confession, an admission of loss that the world did not yet fully recognize. Then came a loss almost beyond comprehension. On September 14, 1968, while Roy was touring England, a fire tore through his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. His sons Roy DeWayne, 10, and Anthony, 6, died in their sleep. Only Wesley, 3 years old, survived after his grandparents pulled him from the house. The fire consumed the home in less than an hour. Investigators concluded it began when an aerosol can exploded near faulty wiring. Roy received the news across the ocean. Everything inside him collapsed. For a long time afterward, he could not write. He could barely speak. Standing upright felt like an effort. He eventually sold the property to Johnny Cash, who planted an orchard across the burned land, telling Roy that only good things would grow there now. The gesture was small, but it carried meaning. Roy later said he wanted to remember the love, not the pain that lived in that soil. The land changed hands over the years, and by 2008, Barry Gibb had built a new home there. Still, the memory remained, embedded both in the ground and in Roy himself. Grief began to erode his health. He chain-smoked heavily, sometimes 2 packs a day. Ulcers that had plagued him since 1960 worsened. Doctors warned that stress was consuming him from within. Yet he kept performing. Music became the only road he knew how to walk, the one thing that kept him upright when life seemed determined to push him down. Amid all of this, Roy made a decision that would reshape his career. In 1965, he left Monument Records, the label behind his greatest successes, and signed with MGM. The offer was enormous, $1 million and the promise of film opportunities. It sounded like a fresh start, but it came with relentless demands. He was required to deliver 3 full albums each year, along with a steady flow of singles. In his first year alone, he recorded more than 70 songs. His debut MGM single, Right Away, barely reached the Billboard Hot 100. At the same time, the British invasion dominated American radio, leaving little room for his sound. His first MGM album reached #1 in Canada and the UK, but in the United States, it passed almost unnoticed. By the end of his MGM years, only 3 songs had cracked the US top 40. His creativity never disappeared. He wrote or co-wrote 42 of the first 70 songs he delivered, but timing and circumstance kept working against him. In 1967, Roy embarked on a punishing Australian tour, 20 shows in just 14 days. He performed across Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, and Mount Gambier. On January 21st, he played 2 shows at Sydney Stadium in a single day. But he carried deep sorrow with him. Claudette had been gone less than a year. Jet lag and grief strained his voice. Reviewers noted that he sounded hoarse, worn down. Still, he took the stage every night, determined to give audiences what they came for, even as each performance drained him further. A year later, he released Walk On in 1968. Many listeners felt it was among his most emotionally honest songs, but it was buried beneath layers of orchestration he never wanted. MGM insisted on a lush, overproduced sound that drowned the clarity of his voice. The single reached number 53 in Australia, number 39 in the UK, number 93 in Canada, and stalled at number 121 in the United States. It became a symbol of his struggle, an artist fighting to be heard while others dictated how his music should sound. Life continued forward. On March 25, 1969, Roy married Barbara Jacobs in Nashville. She was 19 years old. He had met her shortly before losing his sons in the house fire. The wedding attracted paparazzi more interested in spectacle than understanding. Critics dismissed it as a rebound. But for Roy, Barbara brought a small measure of light back into a life overwhelmed by loss. They later had 2 sons, Roy Kelton Jr. and Alexander, and Roy guarded that new family fiercely, even as public curiosity pressed in around his private grief. Later that same year, he returned to Nashville for new MGM recording sessions, but the isolation deepened. Even Bob Dylan noticed it. During a visit, Dylan later said Roy barely spoke, as if the weight of everything had pulled him inward. Roy recorded with session musicians rather than close collaborators, and the studio often felt cold and distant. Years of pressure, loss, and label control had pushed him into a quiet corner, where music no longer felt like refuge. Then came 1970. Roy entered the 1970s still searching for momentum. Under MGM, he released God Love You, hoping it might reconnect him with a shifting audience. The album included Penny Arcade, a song that surged to number 1 in the United Kingdom, his 3rd chart topper there, and a clear sign that British listeners still heard him clearly. In the United States, however, the response was muted. The album sold fewer than 50,000 copies as disco reshaped radio playlists and record store shelves. Roy's sweeping ballads felt increasingly out of step with the moment. Years later, God Love You would become a collector's item, with rare pressings selling for hundreds of dollars. But at the time, it felt like another quiet confirmation that his connection with American audiences was slipping. The years that followed tested him further. In 1972, during an intense British tour, Roy damaged his throat and was forced to stop performing for 6 months. The silence frustrated him, but he filled the nights by writing music for the film Heat, work that earned him a Golden Globe nomination. Still, the injury left him shaken. He worried his voice might never fully return, and the forced absence meant missed promotional opportunities at a moment when his career needed renewed visibility. In 1973, he signed with Mercury Records and attempted to adapt to new musical trends. He recorded a country rock version of Sweet Caroline, hoping to bridge the gap between his style and changing tastes. But the cultural ground had shifted again. Glam rock and punk were rising fast. Artists like David Bowie and Lou Reed dominated headlines, and Roy's single stalled at number 104 on the Billboard chart. The album sold roughly 70,000 copies, far below expectations. Yet this period quietly laid groundwork for future country collaborations that would help him regain stability in the 1980s. Then his health faltered. In late 1977, while vacationing in Hawaii, Roy experienced severe chest pain. Doctors diagnosed advanced coronary artery disease. On January 18, 1978, he underwent triple bypass surgery. He lost 20 pounds and spent months rebuilding his strength. Though the operation saved his life, he never fully gave up smoking, even knowing how close it had brought him to the edge. Against medical advice, he returned to the stage earlier than recommended. Performing was the one thing he could not surrender. Trouble followed again in 1979, when a tour bus accident in Canada led to a serious infection. Doctors warned him that continued touring, combined with ulcers and heart disease, could be fatal. Roy listened politely and largely ignored them. He adjusted schedules when he could, but he kept moving. His devotion to music often outweighed his instinct for self-preservation. In 1980, he released Laminar Flow, a futuristic album built on synthesizers and atmospheric textures. It confused listeners at the time. The record failed to chart, and none of its singles reached the top 100. Yet over the years, it developed a quiet following. Some listeners later compared its sound to early Depeche Mode and the Human League. It wasn't commercially successful, but it revealed Roy's willingness to explore unfamiliar territory long before it became fashionable. Then, in 1988, everything changed. Roy joined the Traveling Wilburys alongside George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. What began as an informal recording session turned into a full album, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1. Roy adopted the name Lefty Wilbury and brought back the soaring harmonies audiences had missed for years. Handle with Care reached the top 50, and the album sold more than 2 million copies. Fans rediscovered him. Fellow musicians welcomed him as an equal. It felt like a rebirth. Almost immediately afterward, Roy recorded Mystery Girl. The album was released in January 1989, just weeks after his death. You Got It climbed to number 9 on the Billboard chart, his highest placement since 1964. The album reached number 5 in the United States and number 2 in the United Kingdom, eventually selling more than 3 million copies worldwide. For a brief moment, the world heard his voice again with fresh clarity, joyful and aching at the same time. Throughout the Wilburys sessions, Roy had been experiencing intense chest pain. Jeff Lynne and others urged him to seek medical help, but he brushed off their concerns. He had survived too many storms and believed he could outrun this one as well. Years of smoking and earlier heart surgery had weakened him, but he kept working. On December 6, 1988, his death came suddenly, though the warnings had long been present. After a day spent laughing and flying remote-control airplanes with his sons, Roy collapsed in his bathroom. He was 52 years old. Doctors were unable to revive him. The autopsy revealed severe arterial blockages, damage that had been building for years. Mystery Girl went on to earn a posthumous Grammy. Roy became the first artist since Elvis Presley to place 2 albums in the top 5 after his death. His wife, Barbara, safeguarded his legacy, later overseeing a hologram performance in 2018 created from more than 200,000 hand-touch frames. In 2019, his sons launched the Roy Orbison Legacy Tour, bringing him back to the stage through a virtual avatar. Audiences across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe watched him sing again in ways once unimaginable. The final note of his story rests in his last conversations. Roy spoke to Barbara about touring plans for Mystery Girl. He felt energized. He felt ready. Doctors had warned him months earlier that without major changes, his life was at risk. Still, he pressed forward. In his final days, he was full of plans, full of family moments, full of a quiet excitement that felt simple and warm, unaware that time had already begun to close around him.